invincible and undetectable deterrent. Julian.
Thanks very much. As you pointed out, that it is a deeply complex technical subject, and I am not going to, from the start, claim to have expertise in the technologies that are involved in the various kinds of anti-submarine warfare that have come into the fore. What I did for this magazine article, and what I'm going to do today, is give a kind of survey of what is out there and maybe sketch out the implications of what is out there for the Trident debate. I got involved in this, or got interested in this, when I went out to do quite a different story. I went to La Spezia on Italy's Ligurian coast, to the NATO Centre for Maritime Research and Experimentation there, to see work that they're doing there on underwater drones and underwater gliders. It was part of a magazine article that was going to look at the changing technologies of the new warfare. So, La Spezia is an interesting place, in a way, a kind of embodiment of the shifting nature of naval warfare. The base itself is mostly a Mussolini-era base. It's completely crumbling as the Italian Navy has contracted. Most of the base has fallen into disrepair, and the big Mussolini-era barracks are falling down, and there are weeds growing in the roads. But in the middle of this base, there is this centre for maritime research, which is humming. It's got all the flags outside, and in all these, again, World War II era workshops, you have technicians, scientists from around the NATO alliance working on what look like bright yellow torpedoes. And these torpedo-looking things are the underwater robots, drones, and gliders, which were originally manufactured for ocean survey, and what they're doing is opening them up, tampering with them, and repurposing them for anti-submarine warfare. And so you have robots that are programmed to cruise the ocean depths until they make contact with an enemy submarine, and then either follow it or surface and send out a signal to give information about the contact, about the nature of the vessel, its direction and speed. Now, the robots are, of course, limited in the amount of time they can spend underwater by the available technology on the battery life. But in La Spezia, they're also working on gliders, which sweep up and down in the ocean currents and use the change in pressure to drive a piston to generate the small amount of electric power that they need to do their tasks. And some of these gliders have remained at sea for months and across the Atlantic. So you have the beginnings of a sustainability of this kind of technology. And obviously for the fraction of the cost of a manned submarine. So you can build hundreds, you can build thousands possibly, of these vessels for the same budget. And so that raises the possibility of operating in a swarm. But to operate in a swarm, you need to be able to, these individual units have to be able to communicate with each other, and that's what the immediate challenge they're working on in La Spezia is how to get these drones, robots, to communicate with each other underwater so that they can work effectively as a network, as a swarm, potentially covering great swathes of the ocean at a time. So as I say, I went there to talk about to write this piece and give sort of tour d'horizon of the new emerging when I was talking to the main program director at La Spezia, an American called Kevin LePage, he started talking about how what they were working on in La Spezia, and of course elsewhere, whatever they're doing in La Spezia, they're doing on steroids in China, in Russia, and the US, and in UK and France. So under the cover of secrecy, what's there at the NATO base in La Spezia is at least what we know about. But they claim they are reasonably, as far as they know, state of the art. And what LePage was saying is that what they were doing in La Spezia would ultimately tilt the strategic balance in underwater warfare against submarines. So I immediately poked up and asked, well, what does this mean then if Trident, if we're about to make this strategic decision about Trident, what does what they're doing in La Spezia, what are the implications of it? And he basically said, well, realizing that the import of, of the question in terms of UK politics, he said, well, that's again above my pay grade. And more recently, he's been less overtly bullish about the new technologies. Most likely he's been made aware up the chain of command about the ramifications of what they're saying, what he's claiming for the work he's doing. And he's stressed that the technology for now is most applicable to shallow coastal waters, which is true. But what he also said is that it may be a leap, but it's not an unthinkable leap to make the same technologies work in deep blue water, where the boomers, the ballistic missile submarines, lurk, where they do their business. And what he said to me is, yeah, I think this will be used in blue water. The technology is completely applicable. Now that applicability, that's the word, is a function of the communication through water and the transparency of the ocean. And these are, of course, the huge challenges, which is why submarines today remain stealth weapons. But they are clearly challenges that are being chipped away from multiple different directions at the same time. There are countless programs underway in the US, Russia, China that we know of that are aimed at that challenge. They inevitably, especially in the US, have fantastic acronyms. There's Distributed Agile Submarine Hunting, which is DASH, Transformational Reliable Acoustic Path System, TRAPS, Submarine Hold at Risk, SHARK, and SQUIDS, which is Superconducting Quantum Interference Devices. What they all have in common is that they pick up the tiny traces produced by submarines of different kinds. Sonar, magnetic, the anti-neutrinos that are produced by any nuclear reactor core, and the underwater wake left by submarines, to name just a few. And what they do is they use new big data techniques and new computer processing capabilities to interpret those trace signals and work away at the opacity of the ocean and build up a reliable picture of what is down there. On the sonar side, there are new techniques, one known as OARS, Ocean Acoustic Waveguide Remote Sensing, which has found a better way of using the ocean's acoustic characteristics than conventional sonar, by using the ocean's advantages in propagating sound or acoustics, in which, as one of the main scientists working on this technology described it, where every column of water in the ocean vibrates like a plucked guitar string. And this technology has been used to detect fish shoals over vast areas, thousands of square miles. But it's also been used by an MIT team to detect the presence of a man-made objects as small as a fire extinguisher. And computer processing also has allowed existing sonar techniques to be used on a much lower frequencies than hitherto, making it potentially more effective at finding subs. You've got magnetic anomaly detectors, which have been used for a long time in aircraft-based submarine hunting, but are now, certainly in the US, being installed on fleets of drones that can work in networks above the sea and operate as a swarm over a large area of ocean. And when it comes to communication between subs or drones or gliders, whereas light waves are used for communication over land, are very large. Most of them are absorbed by water. You have research now in the use of blue or blue-green lasers, which can travel over hundreds of meters, maybe kilometers, which is close enough if you wanted to operate a swarm of small underwater vessels to keep them coordinated, to keep them working together, addressing one of the main challenges behind the use of this drone robotic technology in the form of swarms. And at the same time, you have the rise of cyber warfare, which poses a whole new range of threats to the feasibility, the effectiveness of a nuclear deterrent, either through the possibility of spoofing an attack or disrupting communications between a submarine and land. I went to a cyber war game in Tallinn last year, and two of the things I took away was that the air gapping of computer systems used for nuclear command and control do not necessarily give protection against hacking. There were some Israeli scientists who found ways of jumping air gaps using technology as rudimentary as mobile phones, as dumb phones. And of course, on top of that is the prospect of malware introduced in the original hardware, because all these systems are made up by components that usually come from the cheapest source. So a lot of the components in the US command and control hardware are produced in China, and it has been found impossible to certify almost any of the component parts of the US nuclear command and control system because of this inability to certify 100% that they are free of malware. Because to do that, you would have to make everything yourself from your own factories, from your own suppliers, and that is not feasible in cost terms. Now, obviously, submarines are more isolated than ICBMs and from most other weapons systems by their nature. They're out there in the blue ocean. But they're clearly not immune. Every time they surface and go back to port, they upload patches to the software. Each time they do that, there is a moment of vulnerability. And that risk is heightened by the Royal Navy's decision some years ago to use Windows for submarines, which is a version of Windows XP, for the software on Trident subs. Mostly for cost reasons. The trouble is Windows for software, any Windows-based software, Windows to submarines, and any Windows-based software is more vulnerable just because it is more common. There's more malware out there, and the U.S. Air Force stopped using it for its drones for that reason, that they lost control of their drones because the installed software had malware preloaded on it. So all of these are potential threats to the strategic dominance of the boomer, the ballistic missile submarine. But arguably, none of them yet are actual threats. The sea and the oceans are still very, very big. They're still very, very deep. And all of these technologies, each and every one of them, would have to make a huge leap from where they are now before it can be claimed that the ocean is truly in any way transparent. And at the same time, obviously, the protagonists in submarine warfare on the side of the submarines are developing their own countermeasures to preserve the stealth of ballistic missile submarines. So this is not obviously a one-sided race where submarines out there and the anti-submarine warfare is racing to catch up. The submarines also have a say in the race. And yet somehow a judgment has to be made on where these technologies are going to be in the 2030s when the Trident successor submarine is supposed to be deployed. Obviously, that's an impossible judgment to make because technological development is not linear. It can make huge jumps, or it can hit a hard ceiling and get stuck for years or decades. So it creates an extremely uncertain environment in which to make a 30 billion plus pound gamble on national security that the Trident successor represents. So how should this new wild card, or these many new wild cards, affect the Trident debate? There are two ways it can. One is on the question of whether to invest in a nuclear deterrent at all, the big question. And the other one is, okay, if we're going to have a nuclear deterrent, what kind of deterrent should that be? On the latter, I can't see it having much impact. It's hard to imagine the stealth of submarine-based missiles as a deterrent being compromised to the point where they are more vulnerable than land or air-based missiles. I mean, as a fallback, the Navy can always revert to the bastion strategy that's used by the Russian Navy, in which their boomers are protected out at sea by large numbers of other naval assets. Although that, for a Navy, is an incredibly expensive proposition, because a large amount of your Navy is bogged down in protecting these boomers that you know are not invisible. So I think where the new technologies have their greatest impact is on that basic question of whether we invest so much in having a nuclear weapon at all. That is of little use in most likely scenarios, and which may not even do what it says on the tin in terms of deterring nuclear attacks. But whatever the impact on the Trident debate, the anti-submarine technologies that I've summarized here threaten to turn what has hitherto been a stable, fairly stable deterrent into an unstable one. I mean, as long as Trident submarines are lurking in the deep ocean at all times, and there is reasonable certainty that they can't be found, then there's arguably no good time to stage an all-out attack on the UK. But what about a situation in which the successor submarines become visible, say for brief periods of time, brief windows of time? They're spotted by the emerging anti-submarine warfare. capabilities of an adversary. And now that, in a time of crisis, could provide an incentive to strike in that window because that window is there. And the increasing vulnerability of Trident would increase the pressure on a UK government in a crisis to use it or lose it. So, in short, I mean, I don't know what the answer to the question is in the title of this debate. And I don't know, no one knows whether the Trident successor will be obsolete by the time it deploys. But it's clear that the inability to answer that question changes the nature of the debate, or at least ought to, and changes the nature and stability of the Trident deterrent. So that, I think I welcome any questions.
Well, that's a very good way of launching what I suspect is going to be a substantial discussion. Paul, I saw your hand raised. Do you want to give us a start?
Yeah, I thought Julian's talk, thanks Julian, was an excellent staging post to being something that could be quite stronger. And so I'm going to put out my perspective as a stronger perspective on both where the technologies are and where the implication is. Because you said each needs to make a huge, each of these technologies needs to make a huge leap in order to get the ocean to be transparent. But I'm actually thinking that each one of them is progressing at quite a rapid pace when you compare it to the lead time of the Trident submarines, which is 20 years from now. And you know, you talked about improving battery life and the renewables, the use of solar power to keep it going, the low power requirements. All of this adds up to actually beating that problem probably in the next 5 years. In terms of having these things out relatively indefinitely. You've got autonomous operation, you've got artificial intelligence developing at a huge pace, you've got dramatically improving algorithms, you've got increasing understanding of biosystems, like swarming, but other things as well, which all add up to a very quick shift towards the capability of these things communicating in incredibly intelligent ways. And then you've got the improving sensing capabilities you talk about. But you know, actually, if you just take one of these, the acoustically active acoustic, they can, you know, shoals of fish, whales can be detected over hundreds of kilometres.
Right.
So you don't need the hundreds of thousands or the millions of drones in order to send out the acoustic signals and receive them back. We're talking about much smaller numbers, even today. So, and that's just on one of those technologies, the weight technologies and all the rest of it. And then the processing power under Moore's law is just getting dramatically improved year by year. So all of this, in my book, adds up to no strategic surprise. In fact, it would be a strategic surprise if we didn't have a dramatically improved anti-submarine warfare capability in the next 10 years. Half the time that it takes for Trident to come through. And I think the consequences of this are even more dramatic than you're hinting. So, you know, having submarines that can be detectable means that if you are a nuclear weapon power deploying nuclear weapons, you're putting your nuclear weapons out there into international waters where they're game on. Whereas if you keep them on your own soil, territory, aircraft, whatever, other delivery system, they're more protected by virtue of the fact that you know more about what's going on your own soil, and if somebody attacks with a missile, you know, if somebody attacks a submarine with a missile, the consequences are much less than attacking a homeland with a missile. So there are other reasons why I think, you know, putting your nuclear weapons on submarines is the very worst place to put them if the oceans become transparent. And there are other possible developments like bridging the air gap with electronic warfare capabilities. You know, having a stealth drone come and steal all the information, or neutralise the submarine without the submarine even knowing. And that's the other problem with submarines, is that if you're in a crisis and you want to think about pressing that button, you don't know that your opponent knows where it is and can neutralise it, whereas they do. So there is an incentive, there's an even more destabilising situation around submarines. So I think that's a real problem. when it comes to bastion strategies and the development of hyperglide vehicles and other rapid ways of attacking, I think there's no defence of a submarine in the future. I mean, not now, but in the future. So my challenge, I guess, not to you, but to all of us, is how do we translate those visions and the probabilities rather than the possibilities into a politically effective challenge in the next 5 years. Not in the next few months, because we've lost that. When it comes to Trident vote, we've lost. But when it comes to a newer government in 2020, when we're 5 years on from now and these technologies will be even more obviously a challenge to the deployment of SSBNs, how can we ensure we can stop the programme after they've spent 8 billion and before they spend 41, actually 60 or 70 billion on the new subs?
Well, like I said, what I want about the fish hole technology, the OARS technology,
Yes.
I mean, it does need a static sonar source and then a vertical receiver. And my question, which I don't know the answer to, where I've seen this demonstrated by the MIT guys, is in coastal areas where there are fish, and I don't know the kind of logistical challenges that would be involved in taking that out into blue water and having all these static, acoustic, static stations, and to how vulnerable would those be when you come to, when you talk this through to submariners, they talk about, well, what about our countermeasures? You're going to have static sonar stations. Well, that's a target for us. We are in this game as well, and anything you put out there, we have at least the opportunity to work out counter strategies for. So you put out passive sonar, we'll go after it. I mean, that's the environment in which my uncertainty exists, and I don't have that same certainty. When you go to the other side and say, what about this? They evince at least some element of certainty that they have.
Yeah.
They will be able to deploy their own countermeasures.
Yeah. But you can't attack something in peacetime. That's an act of war. And secondly, they talk a lot of crap about noise cancelling headphones and things like that, which the technology is dreamland technology. So it's bizarre. They say that the stuff we're talking about is dreamland technology, and yet in order to counter it, they talk about technologies that are decades away, if ever, because a submarine is several hundred feet long, and noise cancelling technologies only work in a single point source. But they ignore that because it's convenient to the argument.
What's your thought about what's happening inside this debate in the MOD, in that there must be obviously anti-submarine warfare protagonists and advocates who are telling them, this will no longer, if you're right, there'll be their recommendations is that stealth is a diminishing asset. What do you think how that is playing out?
I think it is playing out in secret, just like it played out in secret around the dreadnoughts before the First World War. And there were voices in the wilderness, but as any scientist will tell you, it takes a long time for a paradigm shift to happen. And the attachments, politically, sociologically, career-wise, are so strong that it doesn't catch up with the technology developments themselves.
This is a great interaction. We ought to give some of the others a chance. Yeah. What about you, Rebecca?
Thank you very much. This was very, very interesting, Julian. Thank you. And I'm sorry I got lost in trying to go around the buildings.
Me too. I got lost.
I should have left more time. But between you and Paul, I think you've made a strong case for, in a sense, for reinforcing those within the MOD that we do know have been raising some uncertainties. They haven't come out publicly because, as Paul said, for very understandable reasons, in secret, but nevertheless those technologies are being questioned. They're not only being questioned in the UK, they're being questioned in France and the US. And so, but as we know, there's not only a technical component to deterrence, there's a political communicative component to deterrence. And it seems to me that if not a perfect storm, certainly the technical issues that you've raised about breaching the so-called invisibility of the nuclear subs is now converging with some of the political issues around deterrence that are coming from a growing number of states who have been raising the humanitarian concerns, and we now know from private discussions with both UK and US, and indeed actually French again, officials, that privately they are now pretty much admitting that they have failed to stop the momentum towards a nuclear ban treaty, that it probably is going to happen. They may be trying to have a rearguard action to stop it being negotiated, but everything they've so far tried to fail to block it has, or derail the initiatives, haven't actually succeeded. So what we have there then is that they are having to look at how they would react in the context in which there's a new diplomatic treaty that they may or may not join. They will probably certainly try to signal that they don't intend to join, but it could well happen within the next few years. And at that point you've got the technical and the political game changers, not just for Trident, but for British nuclear policy as a whole. And it's in that context that I think that you might see a government looking for a smaller, more controllable nuclear weapon system as an interim. Not that they think that it would be more invisible or more controllable in technical terms, but that they give away the technical argument. They accept that actually none of their nuclear weapons is going to, that all of their nuclear weapons are largely going to be obsolete technically, and therefore, given that there is not yet a political majority on within this country certainly, on deciding not to renew Trident at all, they may go for something that costs much less and is much easier to give up at the point at which the politics of the international humanitarian initiatives for a treaty have become overwhelmingly, have come into being and therefore are overwhelmingly necessary to deal with. So again, they're dealing with it in secret. They don't want to, and they will not admit publicly. But I think we've now heard from 3 of the key governments. Of course, part of their argument is, of course, that isn't going to affect Russia or China or any of the others, so they're worried. But the fact is, these are, it's a pincer action that has got to start affecting British nuclear policy thinking.
How does this movement that you're talking towards a nuclear ban treaty correlate with the increasing emphasis we see being put on nuclear weapons after sort of high point of the Obama Prague agenda? Now in both US, Russia, maybe China too, you're seeing an increasing emphasis on the importance of nuclear weapons.
In some ways it's partly affected by and driven by that. It's arising chiefly from the non-nuclear countries who don't want to have to start looking at undermining the NPT through seeking to acquire nuclear weapons of their own, but they feel increasingly insecure that the policies of the 9 nuclear armed states, for different kinds of reasons, are creating a context in which nuclear weapons are being modernized, that there's nuclear saber rattling from Putin and from obviously North Korea, and but also actually from Cameron and so on. So it is a context where what they're seeking is a prohibition treaty under international humanitarian law that then shifts the political legal status within the context that the NPT is then pushing forward, and we know that the last meeting obviously was dismal failure, but is then pushing forward with at least 5 states then being held accountable for the steps towards elimination. So it is a pincer action. It's not expecting to change everything overnight, but as we've seen from other kinds of treaties, including on biological, then chemical, the landmine, plus munitions, once a treaty exists, it does start to affect the political calculus and the military calculus around those weapons. And that's what I think I was talking about, and wondering if you thought about how that fits with your technical analysis.
Carol, can I ask you to get the course discussion slightly better on track?
But I just wanted to, first of all, to say thank you, Julian, and to others here in the room who have really surfaced this issue, because, you know, it's been very much kept in the background, but now it's out there and people are discussing it. You know, the classic today from Basic just produced an article by John Gower, who speaks on this issue. You know, there's been right across the board, so thank you for that. But for me, the core of this is Pugwash's role here is to try and surface the technology and the science behind this. And the workshop we had recently was extremely, I think, effective. And the report, if I can maybe a plug, the report from that will come out in the next week or so and be on the website. But the big thing that came out of that was that in the next 5 years, the scientists intend to have the entire oceans sensed. As you said, OWAR currently 100,000 kilometres, you can pick up the individual signature of an individual whale, the acoustic signature of a whale. If you can do that, you can pick up the individual signature of a submarine. You know, that was what was very strongly coming out of that workshop. But the other thing coming out of it was that with successor, with SSBNs, you've got such a long lead time. You know, the concept for it was done 2011, design is done now, you've got the build time. In that period of time until it hits the water, you have got the evolution, 4 or 5 evolutions of the kind of sensing robotics technologies that we have now. And that's, I think, where the disparity is. There's such a difference there in that rapid development. And I think one of the things that shows it for me is that one of the people we'd hoped to have over but couldn't make it is the former commander of the US submarine fleet, Vice Admiral Connor. And he's retired last year and gone straight into producing his own underwater robotic vehicles.
He knows where the future lies.
Says it all, really. So it's kind of, that's obviously where a lot of people do see the future in this. But what I really wanted to ask about is the ability, and one of the big changes is the ability to network the systems, is sensor fusion. So it's not just that you've got OWAR's technology, or you've got SQUIDs, the magnetic technology, or you've got the blue-green lasers, or it's the ability to actually network. And with the incredible changes in computer processing now, that ability is going to override everything, that you can actually network, fuse all those different technologies. That will make a crucial difference. But another game changer that we discussed in the workshop was artificial intelligence. And I wonder if, as I was coming on to ask, is in La Spezia, did you talk much about the ability, as we heard in our workshop,
to learn, for these anti-submarine robots, to learn from their experience underwater? That they are working on fully autonomous robots that can learn from behaviour of what they're trying to track from submarines, communicate that and network and pass on that learning to a network of robots. And be ultimately fully autonomous, because obviously that is the great prize in underwater technology, because of the different difficulties in communicating You want to be able to send them up, and being able for them to be able to function autonomously. And they have developed a lot of this for anti-mine technology, using robots to find out where there are mines, and then relay that information back to a sometimes a manned ship or a mother unmanned vehicle that dispatches a kill vehicle to hit the mine. So what they're working on at the moment is transposing those kind of AI capabilities to anti-submarine warfare. So yeah, that is one of the fronts of it.
Question over there, then we question there.
The Americans used to claim that they could track all the Soviet submarines, and the Soviets apparently believed it to some degree and adopted the Bastion strategy. The Pentagon or the Navy, US Navy, will be under immense pressure to continue to be able to tell the President or the Commander-in-Chief that they are still able to track Soviet and Chinese submarines. And therefore, one would anticipate that there is a large and increasing budget going into ASW research. And that is probably publicly available as to what the spend is, even if it's not clear quite what the spend is on. I mean, have you been tracking the spend?
No, that's a good question. It is.
I mean, finding out what the Russian and Chinese spend is another.
Yeah, the Chinese. I mean, but the Chinese clearly, even open source, put a lot of money into this and are making quite considerable progress just from open source information. I mean, I think the Pentagon's ability to track Soviet and then Russian submarines has a lot to do with the choke point. The Soviet submarines are limited from where they can deploy, and they have to go past a choke point. And I got the feeling when I was in China recently that one element of the South China Sea standoff has that is because the Chinese are considering launching their first boomer deterrent patrol. It was reported that it happened already, but I don't think it has. The US strategy has been to rely on the first island chain around Southeast Asia as a kind of choke point to be able to spot Chinese boomers if they try and go out into open Pacific Ocean, because in order to reach continental US, they would have to get out of the coastal seas into the deep ocean. So I think below the line, that is one of the elements that is making the South China Sea confrontation, or giving it its edge. But yes, I think that would be a good point of research to look at levels of investment.
Richard?
Yeah, so, I'd like to come back to some of the technology assumptions you made. You had a great focus on networking these things between themselves, and I wonder whether that would actually be needed in all circumstances. The fact that these things, memory is so much better than it used to be.
Yeah.
The fact that, yes, you would need to have these operating as a swarm if you knew you were going to attack tomorrow, but supposing you were trying to understand how the enemy deployed their submarines, did they have patterns of operation? Did they like locating themselves in a certain area of the ocean? All of that you could gain with things that went out of communications range and then came back into communications range at some point and could dump what they'd collected as their data. So I suspect some of those longer term technological problems may actually be overcome much sooner. And of course, if you discover that a particular country's submarines always like hanging around in a particular area or follow a particular pattern, of course you can put your other sensors in there much more easily.
Yeah.
The second one, in terms of future technologies, is simply the ease now of manufacturing. Manufacturing technologies, tolerances, reliabilities have got so much better in the last 20 years, and so much cheaper. And so the thought that a large number of very small devices could be deployed, essentially disposed, that might not have to talk to each other directly, that might not be a problem if some of them actually got knocked out, because you'd assume you've got some wastage because of some non-reliability. It may actually move this a lot faster than people realise, because if these things only cost some dollars a pop, you could leave them hanging around the ocean in really quite large numbers to detect.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think Paul was making one of his papers.
But then the final one is an interesting development on the barrier reef. There are now autonomous underwater systems that are going down destroying certain invasive corals. There was an article in New Scientist at the beginning of this year. And it is now programmed to identify the particular invasive species and, from recollection, inject a poison into it, or some other means of defeating. I have to dig out I've been busy this year, so I have to dig out the article again.
So what's it called? Crown of thorns starfish.
Yes, that sort of thing. Yes, it may well be that, in fact. But here's this problem. If you're starting to get acceptance of autonomous systems outside of weapons, and then you've got a question of underwater activities where there may be no good communications, is this likely to be the first area where you get some autonomous weapon system? And the problem is, what happens if that autonomous weapon system decides to attack a submarine or do some damage to a submarine at the wrong time? I mean, I think this could be potentially highly destabilising.
Wow.
What do you think?
I think that's sort of really good point. We should now sort of change around, because I mean, I think these are great questions and all good subjects for newspaper pieces. I don't have answers for them.
Question from that there.
If these predictions are correct, why is it that the United States is planning to invest billions building 12, I think it is, higher replacement submarines that are going to survive until the 2080s, I think, on current projections, and then they're still building Virginia-class attack submarines, modifying them as each block goes through to enhance their stealth. Why is it that Russia is doing the same thing, and Russian scientists are talking about using new composite materials in their submarines to increase their stealth? I mean, it's not only going to affect the United Kingdom, and I accept the argument that we are different because we have a single delivery system.
Right, we don't have to try
nations,
it.
obviously. But the Americans, I think I'm right in saying, are planning over the next 10-15 years to actually increase the proportion of the deterrent, of their deterrent that goes into the submarine-based system. I think it's going from something like 60%, which it is now, up to the sort of high 70s. So this is not going to... Why is it that we're raising these issues, but we appear to know something that I would argue the people within the Ministry of Defence, the people within the Pentagon, the people within the Kremlin who do this stuff for a living, and the submariners themselves, who don't seem to think it's that much of an issue, because the assessment from coming out of the mod doesn't seem to have changed. The language is that yes, we accept these developments, they are happening, but we are confident that the submarine-based system will remain the most survivable system compared to all the others. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, if you're going to have a nuclear deterrent, you either put it on land, in the air, or in the sea. And the sea is always going to be the least visible of those options, I would argue. Put that question out there.
Yeah, I mean, I have the same impression that if you made this decision to have a deterrent, it's hard for me to imagine a situation where these technologies get to the point where you're less vulnerable on land, especially on a small island like ours. But I know, but in a way, there's the same question I was asking Paul earlier, while we're carrying on, and his response is about this sort of sociology of institutions. Once decisions are made, you risk your careers by openly questioning it. but you're right that not only Russia and China that are doubling down, Russia and the US, but also China is going that way, or at least giving the signs that.
And India and all the other nations which are trying
that are going that way. I mean, in a way, yet again, it's my question as well, which I don't have an answer, but Paul has a strong view.
John?
I just want to interject that I know that the US Air Force and the US Army has been using these sorts of arguments against further developments of the US submarine systems as an inter-service sort of argument, as in, stop doing this, you're going to become more vulnerable, put the money in our side. And then you've been using that in that way, apparently.
No, it's not, I mean, yeah, obviously the US Air Force are pushing a new air launch cruise missile.
I mean, there are lots of discussions about, I don't think it's necessarily the case that a land or an air-based system is going to be more vulnerable than a submarine, as the submarine does become totally visible. You're then on an even, you're getting towards a position where you could be on an even keel. And then you have to start using probably some rather sophisticated statistical arguments to argue that you could well have a less vulnerable land or air-based system. I think it's quite as simple as just saying that it is always going to be more difficult to find a submarine than to find a land-based or an air-based system. I think it's a bit more subtle. I think it probably comes back into the instability argument as well. Sorry, that was a bit confusing.
I would like to.
Can I?
Yeah.
Just in response to the two last contributors, the US Navy's evidence to Congress on the formation, I've forgotten what it's actually called, but it's the shape of the underwater vehicles into 2026. It is really worth having a look at, because it describes all the underwater vehicles they're looking at, the robotic systems, the UUVs, all the different systems, where they're going with it, how many of them, the size, the capability, da. It's well, I'm sure you've already read it like 100 times, but it's well worth looking at. It's open source, it is an open source, and it's well worth how they look to shape their robotics.
I'd like to open up the discussion slightly, particularly with my Pugwash hat on, because we are very pleased to have entered into this debate and to have Julian with us engaged in this debate. And we're encountering, and I think everyone who's in this field is encountering, the problem that some of the information about the technology, about its effectiveness, about countermeasures and so on, is either actually openly published or can be inferred from things which people publish not realizing its strategic significance, and which we can now factor that in. But there's clearly an enormous amount of work going on, enormous funding going into these new technologies and the countermeasures to these new technologies, about which we as yet know nothing. And it was interesting to see that in Rear Admiral John Gower's attempt to defuse the discussion going on within the Pugwash community, he was saying that here were some nice general arguments which showed that we were way off beam, but actually the really convincing arguments which has convinced the British MOD to carry on with its present course are strictly classified, and there's no question of our introducing those arguments. You would just have to believe that we have real experts who will get it all right. Now, Pugwash is very used to that sort of general quality of argument, which very often turns out to be quite misplaced. And indeed, if you look at John Gower's latest blog on the subject, which came out day before yesterday, which you may not all have seen yet, he's being really quite dismissive of a lot of the technology that we're suggesting that's just on its way, and saying that when you look at the numbers, it's totally impractical. You could never spend that sort of quantity of money on those sorts of numbers of drones and so on. And you're going to have to go for choke points. And if you go for choke points, then you're going to, first of all, you're going to be exposing your technology to the counter technology of the other side, who know just as well as you would do where the choke points are. But anyhow, those are precisely the areas where there's a lot of electronic noise going on from all and ordinary domestic shipping and so on, which is going to interfere with your technology. And it's going to be a devil's own job to devise a system which is really good at tracking a submarine through the choke point before you ever get it out into the deep sea. And so on. You know, those are the sort of arguments which are being deployed by those who say, you simple-minded creatures in Pugwash or Basic, you don't know what you're talking about, just leave it all to us. Now, I'd be interested to hear, for those of you who have been engaging in this debate, how you react to that sort of stance.
I could say that don't you remember a quote from the previous Secretary of Defence, who argued against some of the points we were putting in the early days of the Trident debate, and he came out a few years later and saying that the MOD had misled him and that we were right.
I think it's a reasonable argument from John, because people do have to keep these things secret. There is clearly a debate, there is clearly a need to keep things secret in order to retain technological advantage. So it's a rational position, it's a rational point. I think it points to an overriding need for us to go several steps above the place we usually go, and to look at common interests and common values here. And the common value is security and reducing nuclear risk and reducing risks to national security. And this comes full circle to my point about the implications for strategic stability of putting your nuclear weapons on submarines. Because if these technologies have any cogence over the next 10 to 20 years, whatever you believe in nuclear deterrence and the rest, this has serious implications for strategic stability and to nuclear risk. And so we have to wake up to that and have a conversation. Whatever the current state of the technology is, whatever the state is in 10 years' time, there is a possibility, and I believe a very high probability, that the current situation will not pertain. So let's get together and talk about this collaboratively rather than dismissing these concerns.
Yes, Beck.
Thank you. I think Paul is largely right on this one, and actually, so is John. This is very familiar. I can remember way back in the early 80s when people were basically trying to say that the US was in the process of deciding to upgrade the Trident missiles, and and the UK should actually not do the submarines until we were much bigger. We were kind of being poo-pooed right up until the government was prepared to do a flip-flop on the decision-making and go for D5 when they'd been, completely dismissing. And they've done that time and time again. Same thing with, cruise missiles melting into the countryside, deterrence then also being made dependent on an invisibility that, most of us were pointing out wasn't actually going to happen, going to work in practice. So I think that this is more of the same. I totally understand the arguments why they're trying to dismiss all of these technologies and issues, but I think that we need to pursue them to show what the risks could be. Also because, and I think Julian, you particularly mentioned this, I think they're still obsessed with what Russia is doing most of all, and I think they're not looking sufficiently closely at what China is doing, and China often surprises us by, China's whole approach to deterrence has been different, and so China pursuing visibility in terms of the other submarines, that makes a lot of sense for China to pursue, to erode the deterrence that it sees the others having, that it feels is being eroded for itself by things like missile defense. So, for all these reasons, it seems to me that we have to carry on exposing what the risks are of getting this wrong, both technologically and I do bring back, you know, you thought I was taking us off message, but actually the point that I was trying to make is just as deterrence has a technical and a political communicative element, so does you know, so does visibility in a sense, and also so does, and I could return to our title here, obsolescence. Obsolescence isn't only when something is technologically outrun, it's also when something is politically outrun. And you could argue that actually Trident, the first Trident, was obsolete politically by 1994 when the first sub actually rolled. We don't know whether it was completely obsolete technologically because, thank God, we've actually not really needed to you know, for any aspect to be tried out. But it certainly had a political obsolescence in there. This time it's going to be much larger than that, and the risks of getting it wrong are, I think, much higher.
Thank you. Richard?
I was just going to go back in time to a period when there was a bit of controversy about some of the facilities at Coalport and the suggestion there needed to be some secrecy. And I think it gives a useful lesson. One of the facilities at Coalport was for reducing the acoustic signature of the submarine, and there was a desire not to talk about what the role of this particular building was. It turns out, and this is now on the public record, that the role wasn't so much to make the SSBNs as quiet as possible as to make them sound the same as the hunter-killers. And it's why the facility had to be in a place where the hunter-killers could go in, where the SSBNs, because the SSBNs had a sort of private area. And while this was being discussed as to whether this factor could be allowed to be released, was the question, what do the Russians do? Oh, well, the Russians do exactly that. The Russians make all their submarines sound exactly the same, so we can't tell which are the SSBNs. And so it became a very interesting situation of, yes, we can't talk about these the ways of operating because they're so desperately secret. But actually the people we're most fearful of do exactly the same. We know that, and they know we do it. So it's a very, you know, I do have a sense that in some of the discussions about these technologies are going to be exactly the same. The clever people on the Russian side are going to be thinking the same thoughts that's been happening in this room. And they will be thinking the same things that the MOD are worried about. And in fact, the people who are left in the dark are actually the public rather than those within the governments. So.
I'm thinking that if there are these huge debates going on in the US and UK about the obsolescence of the SSBNs, and that they press on regardless, huge amounts of money, and the implication is a great strategic risk, then we're going to have some great links from the Pentagon and from the UK MOD if this is true, you know, that we're gambling on the wrong horse.
Yes.
I think the problem for Britain with Trident is because they're choosing one type of deterrent. If you ask, for example, the Chinese, Russian, or the Americans, they could change from cruise missile, airplanes, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarines. So it is always shifting from one technology to the other according to the need and the advance of technology. If Britain determined to have deterrent, then they would just say, we have no other choice. Really, the whole question would be, if you tell them, well, you don't need these nuclear weapons, well, you're going back to the principle that they actually want it, and they have no other choice. So really, the argument is, if you follow what I'm trying to say, is there is no argument. They want deterrent, they want to keep nuclear weapons. They have no other choice because maybe the other choice is not so reliable. Back to square one.
But wouldn't you say that the reason why Britain has done what it has is that it's always wanted to punch beyond its weight? And if you're going to do that, if you're going to try and have a deterrent on a very limited budget, you have to take technical risks. You have to back one horse,
Absolutely.
spend your money on that, and then be prepared suddenly to jump to another horse if your first horse really seems to be wounded. And what we're arguing about now is whether our first horse is wounded or not.
Yeah, but they could go to space. I mean, next time, if you tell them, you know, this is going to be obsolete in 10, 20, 30 years, and they're determined to have these weapons, then they will say, well, let's go to space work. Space work. I mean, the argument is, what I'm trying to say is somebody determined to have that. They will then play around. I mean, it's really compromise between somebody on the other side, thinking the other way.
Well, you have to decide on one. If you think that a space weapon is really superior to any terrestrial-based weapon, fine. But I haven't heard anyone suggest that that's a sensible option. So it's
Nukes in space are illegal under international law. Not that that's necessarily stopped people in the past.
But I think the key thing is what you're achieving by having that. And I think a lot of us acknowledge that the UK is actually trying to achieve a political role through having nuclear weapons. So, you know, that's why I think that the point that Paul made in his first intervention explains why even if submarines, that if, for example, in the Labour policy review, you know, there was the question, why were the Lib Dems and then Labour beginning even to think about looking at nuclear armed crews or bomb stack on planes and things like that? It would make sense if the invisibility of nuclear submarines is eroded, and that's the point that John made, because then there's a level playing field. But it also makes sense if what you're wanting is the political attribute of having nuclear weapons at the lowest possible cost, given that you then adapt your, and they would adapt the deterrent strategy. At the moment they're clinging, saying, deterrence requires continuous at-sea deterrence, which requires 4 nuclear submarines. But since the 1950s, deterrence has taken various different forms, adapting to the size of the arsenal, the technologies, and so on and so forth. So they would basically suddenly wake up one morning and persuade a lot of media pundits to say that deterrence means something different, and it means what we're now going to get. And that would persuade, and it could be cheaper, and it could also be more temporary if they do become convinced that actually the writing's on the wall through other political and international means, i.e. nuclear treaty. That's, I think, part of what the equation that we need to be paying a bit more attention to.
May I just add to that? I think the vulnerability is irrelevant to the situation vis-à-vis the French. The French submarines will be at least as vulnerable as ours. So what? I mean, Britain maintaining a position in Europe, not the referendum, but over nuclear weapons.
I think we have reached the point in this discussion where it would go even better if it was lubricated. So I think I propose that we adjourn across the corridor, where you're all invited to stay for a glass or whatever you would like, and some nibbles. And I think I just want to thank Julian very much for all you've done to create what I think is a discussion which shows we're seriously interested in your subject, even if we don't all have quite the same take on it. Thank you very much.